Hello, everybody. I never know exactly when to say hello with these things because people are constantly coming in. So I'll say hello again. Hello. Welcome to the latest edition of the Brooklyn Rails New Social Environment series with the Wednesday afternoons devoted to poetry readings. This is the 562nd episode. Are they episodes, Nick? Or this is the 562nd show of the New Social Environment series, and I think it's the 86th poetry reading. I seem to now have these numbers built into my brain. We have a terrific and somewhat differently formatted reading for you today. We're going to be focusing on a brand new book by poet and prose writer Barbara Henning called Ferne, a Detroit story. And accompanying Barbara in presenting the work, which will be, there'll be a visual component also, we have Martine Bellen and Peter Bushyeager. So thanks to all three of you for being here. I'm going to introduce Barbara, Martine, and Peter all up front because they're going to be working together throughout the presentation of the work. And then we'll have a conversation after the reading that will be open to everyone in the audience if you'd like to join in or ask questions. We can take questions in the chat, or you can wave your hands or do a jumping jack or something like that, and we'll try to see you in the squares. You can also just keep an eye on the chat for links to various works by our three readers and other information related to the rail, and the reading is being recorded so it can be circulated once it's posted on the Rails website and onto the so-called YouTube channel. I don't know why I said so-called, it's just a nervous tick. Barbara Henning was born in Detroit and is the author of 4 novels and 8 collections of poetry, as well as many chapbooks and essays. Her books include a novel, Just Like That, the poetry books Digigram and A Day Like Today. She's also the editor of a book of interviews, Looking Up Harryette Mullen, the selected prose of Bobbie Louise Hawkins, and Prompt Book, Experiments for Writing Poetry and Fiction, which just came out in 2020. And also this book, Ferne, a Detroit story, which I will let her introduce here. It's a fabulous book. Martine Bellen has a book in the works called An Anatomy of Curiosity, her 10th poetry book, which will be published by Mad Hat Press this fall. Other books include The Amazing Cage of Light, New and Selected Poems, The Vulnerability of Order, and Tales of Murasaki and Other Poems, which was a winner of the National Poetry Series. Peter Bushyeager's books include Citadel Luncheonette and In the Green Oval. He edited Wake Me When It's Over, selected poems of Bill Kushner from Talisman House, and writes poetry-focused articles that have appeared in Gathering of the Tribes, Talisman, Exquisite Corpse, and the book of interviews, What is Poetry? Just Kidding, I Know You Know. Please welcome Barbara, Peter, and Martine. And Barbara, you can take it away.
Thank you, Anselm. Many thanks to Anselm and the Brooklyn Rail for hosting this event and all the people involved. And thanks to Martine Bellen and Peter Bushyeager for reading with me. This book is part image and part text. First, I'm going to read a few paragraphs from the introduction. Then I'll read the narrative, mostly from chapter 9 and a bit from chapter 8. Martine and Peter will read from the news clippings included in the chapters. I'm going to show some of the images and photos after the intro, and then at the end of our reading, I'll show the rest of those that were in that chapter. So I'm going to begin with from the introduction, and that'll give you a lot of context for understanding what the book was about. I start out with a passage from Mikhail Bakhtin. Just as a body is formed initially in the mother's womb, A person's consciousness awakens wrapped in another's consciousness. When I was born on October 26, 1948, in St. Joseph's Hospital in Detroit, Michigan, I was Ferne Elizabeth Hostetter's first child. For 9 months, my heart beat alongside her heart. I moved when she moved. I listened to the muted sounds of her voice as she talked to my father, her mother, and sisters. Then for 11 years, the dialogue that mattered most to me was with my mother. I listened to her tell stories about her childhood growing up in the city. I listened when she talked with her mother and her closest sister, my Aunt Jean. My understanding of my existence and my ethics and values started to take shape by listening to my mother. I remember once sitting at her feet listening while she put pin curls into my hair. She explained that her life might be cut short. She was probably going to die soon, and as the oldest child, I would have to take her place. On January 4th, 1960, she died. I was 11 years old. As I went from being an adolescent to a teen, I kept trying to find her in my dreams and memories, to become like her, perhaps to even become her. Skipping forward. As a young woman, Ferne documented her life with photographs, arranging them into 20 small photo snaps books. When I was young, I would pore over these photos. Then she was with her Buster Brown, there she was with her Buster Brown haircut, and there I was with mine. We children loved going to visit her mother, our grandmother, on Sunday afternoons, becoming part of a gathering of 8 children and their families, eating, laughing, and playing together. In the albums, I could peek back into my mother's childhood right there in that same house. Then we drive home to our tract house in a nearby suburb where there were no streetcars and the world was much quieter. When I was 18 years old, I moved into an apartment on the east side of Detroit, right around the corner from where my mother had grown up. In 1996, when my father died, my family gave me the Snaps books. He had locked them away for 35 years, never letting us look at them, the same way he had locked away the pain from the loss of his wife. Little by little, as I scanned the photos for my brother and sisters, I started to imagine and write about Ferne's life. But I needed to know more about Detroit during the time when she was a child and a young woman. As I was going through the albums, I came upon a photograph Ferne had taken August 20th, 1939, in the alley outside her house with the notation, Times Paper Boys. My grandparents had rented garage space to the Detroit Times. The boys would pick up papers there and start their roots. My father had also worked as a paper boy and picked up his papers from their garage. When I read about the history of the newspaper, I learned that William Randolph Hearst and his son had owned it for almost the same period that my mother had lived, 1920 to 1960. Because there were so many connections, I decided to consult this newspaper to understand what was happening in Detroit during Ferne's lifetime.
In a pamphlet from the Labor Library in Detroit, a description of the Detroit Times. The Times featured colorfully reported hometown news for the man on the assembly line. It made the greatest circulation gains during the turbulent 20s and 30s by its sensational stories of crimes and scandals. The paper was considered second to none in covering the blood on the streets news. Its feature and advertising were geared to the lower economic strata, and circulation among the growing white-collar class never became widespread.
Okay, now I'm going to share a screen with you and show you a few images. This is the cover of the book. That's Ferne when she was about 16 years old, on the corner, if you're from Detroit, anybody in the corner of Alter Road and Mack Avenue, where the streetcar was. Okay. 1938, I think this one was. And then these are the Snaps books. I hope everybody can see these. Okay, that I was given, and what these books inspired the story, really. It started with these books, and I would write in response to the photos in the beginning. Then this is the photo that I got really inspired by with the Times paper boys in 1939 posing outside of her in the alley outside their house. And these photographs are not with chapter 8 or 9, a little bit before, but I wanted to show them to you to give you some context of the people that you'll meet as I start reading. This was her second husband. Her first husband she was married to for 2 months. She was very young. And then she married Abe, and we'll be reading about him a bit. This gives you a sense of his personality a little bit. This was at their engagement party. And they used to go to Eastwood Gardens, which was at 8 Mile Road in Gratiot in Detroit. There was a big fair there, and they would have big bands that would come in to dance, and everyone would go dance. And that's her sister, Jean. They were the 2 youngest of the 8 children, and her boyfriend, and that's Ferne and Abe. Okay, now I'm gonna stop sharing, and I'm gonna give you, I'm gonna read a little bit to catch you up with where we're at. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Ferne was 22 years old. On this day, the Allied troops began pushing Nazi Germany back. Ferne and her sister Jean hoped that meant the war would be over soon and their husbands would be spared. Then in the middle of July, they both got orders to ship out. No one knew where they were going, but surely somewhere in Europe. Martine, you're muted.
More typists needed for war work. The rat-tat-tat of a typewriter manned by you, Sue Smith of Detroit, may prove to be just as deadly to the Japs or Nazis as the similar sounding, death-dealing clatter of a machine gun. You may have the satisfaction of knowing you're hurling a blast at the enemy and getting paid for it. Salaries start at $1,260 per year for a 40-hour week, with time and a half for all overtime work.
Let all off to vote, FDR tells industry. President Roosevelt requested today that any employee who is not allowed sufficient voting time away from his job next Tuesday inform me of the circumstances, together with the name of his company and any pertinent facts.
After Abe was sent overseas, Ferne rarely heard from him, but she wrote him almost every day. When his letters arrived, anything indicating where they were was blacked out. But he did mention at one point that there were so many casualties that almost half its platoon had been taken prisoner, wounded, or killed. Fighting was fierce, nothing like he had ever expected. He mentioned having a lot of trouble with his feet because of the flooding. Ferne wrote him on November 20th, asking him to tell his brother-in-law Marv if he saw him that Jean had just had a beautiful little boy, little Marvelyn. He's got red hair and he looks like a baby picture of Marv. We're waiting for both of you to come home. Lots of love, Ferne. In early December, a Western Union messenger knocked on the door. Jean walked into the room with Marvelyn in her arms. Hattie handed her the envelope and took the baby. Jean was crying even before she could tear it open. Oh my God, Ma, he's missing in action, missing. Hattie followed her into the bedroom. I'm very sorry, dear. Maybe he will be found. Let's pray for him, Jeannie. Let's pray for him. When Ferne came home from Briggs, she found her sister locked in her room and her mother was taking care of the baby. That night, Hattie wrote a letter to Marv's mother in Minnesota, a woman neither she nor Jean had ever met.
Dear Mrs. Bobbie, I don't know if I should tell you this or not, but I think you must have word by now. Jean got a telegram from the War Department saying Marvel has been missing since November 13th. I do hope they find out more about the real facts, as Jean and all of us will feel better about it. He is possibly a prisoner of war or in some hospital. Please let us hear from you. Our phone number is under the name Ferne Abriel, Tuxedo 12609. So if you would rather call Jean, you will be able to do so. The baby is doing nicely, but I hope he doesn't get a setback because Jean is surely taking this awful hard. Mrs. Bobbie, I do wish I were able to talk with you. I might be able to help you, but God knows best if this has to be. I hope and pray we will be able to bear up. Let us hear from you. With sympathy, Mrs. Hostetter.
A few days later, Ferne heard from Abe. Thank you so much for all your letters, Ferne. They mean a lot to me. I got a stack of them today. It's great about the baby. Give Jean a kiss for me. I haven't seen Marv in a while. We aren't in the same platoon and we've been out on different actions. After writing 3 letters to the War Department, Jean received a letter from the Adjutant General explaining that, quote, the term missing in action is said only to indicate the whereabouts or status of an individual is immediately not known. I wish to assure you, Mrs. Bobbie, that at any time additional information is received, it will be transmitted to you without delay. Experience has shown that many persons missing in action are subsequently reported as prisoners of war. Now we're in chapter 9. After taking off so much time, Ferne was at the bottom of the list for seniority at Briggs. In March, when the production started declining, she was laid off. She had only a small monthly stipend from the Army for Wives, $28 plus $22 a month from Abe's allotment. She gave half of this to Hattie to help with the bills for the house. She also made money by making drapes and clothes for friends and neighbors. They would buy the fabric and she'd make the dress or coat. Today, she was working on making a little jumpsuit for Marva Lynn out of scraps left from a neighbor's blue striped dress. She went into Jean's room to measure him. Gosh, he's bigger than he was 3 days ago. Jean, I can't believe it. I'll have to extend this pattern. She picked him up and laid him on the bed. He giggled and rolled over, watching Ferne with his eyes as she wiggled the yellow measuring tape around him like a dancing snake. What a head full of red hair he has. Where did that come from, buddy? I hope his father comes home soon. What will we do without him? Jean was folding diapers and putting them into a big basket in the corner. In his last letter, Abe had written that they had lost so many guys that his platoon looked entirely different from when they started. He mentioned that they were crossing over into Holland soon, and this time not one line in his letter was censored. While Ferne was sewing the pieces together, Marva Lynn was asleep, and Jean was on the porch with Hattie. The house was quiet except for the sound of Ferne's foot pumping the pedal on the machine. After several days of rain, the clouds moved over the horizon. Ferne and Jean took the baby and the carriage over to the children's playground on Nottingham. Whenever Jean stopped pushing the swing, Marva would cry. Then she'd push him again. Then she'd stop and he'd start to whine. Then she'd push him again. Suddenly, Jean started crying. What have they done to him, Ferne? There's a good chance he's alive and in a prison, Jeannie. Look what the Nazis did to the Jewish people. The Soviets found thousands in a concentration camp. Millions killed, millions of children. Even if he is a prisoner, we don't know that Marv's okay. I'm sick of this war. Nothing will ever be the same. I think we will still love each other. And if we keep that alive, maybe that's all we can do. Abe thinks the war will be over soon. Ferne took the baby out of the swing. His cheeks were bright red from the cold. She adjusted his hat to cover his ears, kissed his cheek, and set him in the carriage. Then they walked home, crossing over the borderline between Grosse Pointe and to Detroit. As they were waiting for the light to change, Jean noticed Ward's son, Terry, on the porch. Stay there, Terry, she yelled. Don't come down the stairs. The streetcar horn blew a warning, and little Terry held on tight to the railing, waiting for them to arrive. Then he came running down the front steps toward them. Next time, Auntie Ferne, take me to the park too, he said. After dinner, Hattie turned on the radio for the news. They were stunned. President Roosevelt had died from a stroke. Hattie started to cry, then Jean and Ferne too. Terry looked around with concern. Grandma, he said, what's wrong? Why is everyone crying?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Fulton Lewis Jr. speaking from the Mutual Studios in New York City. This nation has suffered this day a staggering loss. At this moment in Warm Springs, Georgia, the President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, lies with the problems of the nation finally lifted from his shoulders. Stricken late this afternoon with cerebral hemorrhage, he passed away before his physicians could be of any assistance, if assistance in such a case is possible at all. Vice President Harry Truman, who from here on will be President Truman, went immediately to the White House. A special cabinet meeting was called, and we should know more about what is going to happen in Washington as the evening wears on. But Franklin D. Roosevelt, the first president to be elected for 4 terms in the White House, has passed away. And that is overshadowing all of the news events that have happened or could happen for quite some time. April 12th, 1945.
FDR's death stuns Detroit. In the home and factory and office and on the street in Detroit today, there will be but one topic of conversation: President Roosevelt's death. The atmosphere was of awe and reverence, of the stature of the mighty man who had fallen in action as truly as any soldier. The city moved quickly to honor his memory.
Nazi radio announces war ends in Europe. Murder of 5 million in Nazi camp charged. Dr. Bela Fabian, one-time president of the Hungarian Independent Democratic Party and prisoner of the Nazis, charged Wednesday that German elite guard troops had slaughtered 5 million men, women, and children at the Auschwitz concentration camp in Upper Silesia.
When news came on May 7th that the Germans had surrendered, the celebration in the city was subdued. Some stores had closed, expecting possible damage from the crowds, but it was difficult for everyone to get excited with half the soldiers still in the Pacific fighting Japan. Every afternoon, Jean waited on the porch for the mailman with news about Marv. 3 weeks after V-Day, a telegram was delivered stating that he had been returned to military control. Just one sentence and Jean was bouncing Marvelyn on her foot and singing "The Saints Come Marching Home." Marvelyn always giggled when his mom was happy like this. A week later, Marv called from France. He was in a hospital recovering, and they were going to keep him there for another month, feeding him and helping him put on weight. "I love you," was said back and forth. "I love you too, so much." Ferne was washing dishes and listening. Hattie was reading the paper. Luke Jr. would be coming home soon too. He'd been sent to Europe. He had written that he was fine. Lynn was recently sent from Europe to the Philippines, playing the trumpet in a military band. Hattie wasn't sure when he'd come back. One afternoon when Ferne came into the house, she found Hattie scrubbing the floor in the kitchen and weeping. "What are you doing, Ma? What's wrong? How could Christians do this?" She pointed to the paper. Ferne had read about it before, but this article about the Nazi methods and about the children was devastating. Ferne put the paper down and went outside for a walk. One must go on, she thought. How would the world ever recover from this war that had killed so many people? That was a question in many people's minds. How could you go on living in the same way?
This is VE Day, official, peace in Europe, victory. Truman, Churchill say so. President Truman, speaking to a victorious nation, today told the American people that the hour of complete victory had come in Europe and that Germany had surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. At the same time, the president directed a grim warning to Japan that now that the war is over in Europe, the greatest military machine in all world's history would be unloosed upon the Japanese homeland to bring about its utter destruction and unconditional surrender.
Japs cease fire, Tokyo says. House hints end of induction. jobs to fade for 8 million. 300,000 facing VJ layoffs here. Army, Navy to cancel 90% of orders. Between 250,000 and 300,000 Detroit war workers will be jobless within a week after official VJ Day, it was estimated Saturday by R.J. Thomas, president of the UAW-CIO. U.S. reveals atom bomb pearls world. The atomic bombs, which wrought cataclysmic destruction upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were relatively harmless. A slight improvement would have made them weapons of such unimaginable power as to threaten the end of the world.
When Abe came home, they rented a small frame house in Roseville, a suburb on the east side of Detroit. They needed a car if they were going to live in a place that didn't yet have streetcars or buses. Parking lots were abundant. So Ferne and Abe used their savings to buy John's old car. As soon as they moved in, Ferne started putting the house in order, making drapes and buying kitchen things from the dime store and a resale shop a few blocks from their house on 12 Mile Road. But why couldn't Abe find work? Marv was lucky. He found work right away as a bus driver in Detroit, driving the Chalmers Street bus. On weekdays, Abe took the car and went out looking for work in the factories. But when the soldiers came home from the war, work was hard to come by. The women had been laid off from their jobs and the factories weren't pumping out war machinery like they had been before. On top of that, the thousands of Southerners who had migrated for defense work were still living in Detroit trying to hold on to their jobs. Every night, Abe came home without success. He sat in the chair in the corner smoking and drinking beer. Ferne was tense. How would they pay their rent? They both had saved some money during the war and the Army was giving him $80 a month unemployment for 1 year, just barely enough to scrape by on. After being in ground combat and before that traveling from one base to another for 2.5 years, the transition was difficult. Ferne understood that, but she didn't know what exactly he had gone through. She knew that a lot of the men in his platoon had been killed, and she'd heard the stories of what had happened to Marv when he was captured, nearly starved, marched hundreds of miles, crammed into railroad cars with no air or light, and stood beside other prisoners who were shot for simply asking a question. Abe, on the other hand, had fought his way across Germany. He was used to living in dangerous situations. He had a Bronze Star for heroism, but he came home a different person from the young man she had married. At first, he was joyful and happy to be home, but as time passed, he became somber and he started drinking too much. She tried to get him to tell her what he did for the medal, but he just said, "I helped another soldier. You wouldn't understand." Marv and Jean found a house just a block away from the Abriels. In the afternoon, Ferne would often walk down the street to visit. Jean now had 2 children, Marva Lynn and a new baby, Karen. "Why don't I ever get pregnant?" Ferne asked. "You get pregnant every time Marv looks at you. Do you think it has something to do with the operation?" Jean asked. "Maybe I won't be able to have children." "That just breaks my heart, Jean. It doesn't seem fair. And on top of that, Abe isn't getting a job, and I don't think he's really trying. He's gone all day and then he comes home with no good news." Marv told him he knows a place where he could get some day labor, but he wants to find something better, Jean said. "You're lucky with Marv, even though after everything he went through, he's still optimistic and he loves the children. I wish I could have a baby. That might help us. If something doesn't happen soon with Abe, I'm going to have to find work. What could you do out here? Maybe a waitress job. Maybe if I get to know people around here, I could start sewing again."
Marriage certificate discovered in papers. Nuremberg. Discovery of Hitler's will and a political statement. The documents were found in a suitcase 30 miles south of Munich. Hitler's political statement blamed the war on those international statesmen who were either of Jewish origin or who worked in the Jewish interest. "It is my wish that I and Eva Braun, who married me when she volunteered to share my fate in besieged Berlin, should be cremated immediately. He and his bride, Eva Braun, preferred death to the disgrace of being forced to surrender. German eyewitnesses previously had testified that the 56-year-old Hitler and his 35-year-old bride committed suicide after a macabre wedding supper, but their remains never have been found. Hitler said he had enjoyed many years of true friendship with Eva. Hitler said he had enjoyed many true years of friendship with Eva, whose recently uncovered diary showed she was tormented with fear that she was losing him to other women and that she once contemplated suicide. The suitcase also contained 3 photographs, 2 of which were believed to be of Eva and the other of an unidentified boy about 12 years old.
Light a lucky, and you'll never miss sweets that make you fat. Beautiful women keep youthful slenderness these days by smoking Luckies. There's real health in Lucky Strike. That's why folks say it's good to smoke Luckies. For years, this has been no secret to those men who keep fit and trim. They knew that Luckies steady their nerves and do not harm their physical condition. They know that Lucky Strike is the favorite cigarette of many prominent athletes who must keep in good shape. They respect the opinions of 20,679 physicians who maintain that Luckies are less irritating to their throat than other cigarettes.
War over, but there's no peace. Future gloomy, von Wiegen says. At Havana, aboard a Spanish motor ship to New York. 8 months after the end of the war in Europe, there's no peace. There is civil war in China and continuing hostilities in Java. It is the year of great hunger in Europe and Asia. Perhaps never before in history, so dark and gloomy an outlook into the future. America enters the year 1946 of epochal developments as world power #1. Not since the Roman Empire under Augustus has any country been so completely world power #1 in all domains: military, political, economic, financial, scientific, and commerce. As is America at the dawn of 1946. Russia is our one formidable rival and will not cease to strive to occupy one day the position now held by America.
Danger in laxity of teenagers. Juvenile delinquency. Wars are fertile soil for it. Millions of our youth will muddle through this period into the normal and good life. Others will succumb. Do you remember the flapper? She was that controversial girl of the 20s. She was jazz mad, drank cocktails, slapped on the lipstick, and was allegedly on her way to the dogs. But apparently, she never received that limbo of baying canines supposed to lie in wait for young generations. Instead, she married her returning doughboy, who was the GI of World War I, and they became the parents of the Bobbie Sockers. And so we had that slim young stick of 1920 dynamite developing into the not so slim mother of 1945.
When Ferne finished eating the dinner she had prepared for both of them, she sat in the armchair by the window and lit a cigarette. She was smoking far too many cigarettes lately, and she was starting to lose weight again. In the morning, when she was sorting their laundry, she found a small piece of folded up paper in Abe's pocket with a woman's name on it, Marion. So that's what has been going on. All those days looking for work, and now this. For 3 years, she'd waited for him. She wrote him letter after letter, gave up her job, moved out of her mother's house, and here she was now alone in a little house in Roseville. It was becoming more difficult to imagine having a family with him. She put out the cigarette, put on her coat, and walked over to Jean's. They had just finished eating dinner and their new baby was asleep in the bedroom. Marvelin jumped up and down when he saw Ferne. He climbed up on her lap and showed her a little wooden horse Marv had made for him. See my horsey, Auntie Ferne? She hugged him and sat down at the dining room table with Jean. She tried to hold back the tears. Marvy, Jean said, take your horsey and go play with Daddy, okay? Off he went. What's wrong, Ferne? That shit, she started sobbing. Jean put her arm around her. What now? He didn't come home for dinner and I found this in his pants pocket. She put the paper in Jean's hand. Maybe it's a number of someone for work. Come on, Jean, come on. Marv walked into the room. What's wrong, Ferne? She folded her arms on the table and laid her head down on her arms, weeping. When Jean explained the situation, Marv said, I'm sorry, Ferne, very sorry. That night, Abe didn't come home until 10 o'clock. When Ferne laid the note in front of him, he looked down at the floor. He didn't deny it. He said, it doesn't mean anything. It was just something in the moment. Something in the moment? Did you sleep with her, Abe? I can't do this. We made a promise to each other. But you didn't mean it, did you? Have you been sleeping with women all the time you've been gone? Have you? Have you? He put his coat back on and went out the door. She yelled behind him, that's my car too, buddy. Then he drove off. She lit a cigarette and sat on the porch looking at the moon, barely visible behind a blanket of clouds. The next morning when he didn't come home, she dialed the number. A woman answered and Ferne hung up. She put on her coat and went over to Jean's. Jean had pumped Marv for more information. Finally, he gave in and told her that when they were in the service in the States, Abe was always trying to get him to go out with other women. Marv wouldn't, though. Abe used to say, oh, come on, they aren't here. It won't matter. Ferne stood up, clenched her fists closed and moaned, trying to hold back the tears. I want him out of the house, she said. This can't work. I can't have children with someone I don't trust. And I'll never trust him again. I'm going home and packing up his things. If I were you, Ferne, I'd do the same thing, Jean said. Do you want me to come with you? No, I'll do this myself. When he came home, she didn't shed a tear. She looked at him and said, leave the car keys in the car and get your stuff out of here. He looked at the two small boxes of his clothes sitting in the middle of the living room. Then he threw the keys on the table, turned around and walked out the door. Of course, where else could he go but to Marv and Jean's? Later that night, Marv came by and picked up Abe's things. Ferne wasn't there. While the divorce was in process, Abe was frequently over at the Bobbie house. To avoid encountering him, Ferne had to stop visiting with her sister. It seemed like she lost not only her husband, but also her sister. At the end of the month, she emptied out the house, turned it back over to the landlord, and moved back in with her mother. Later in the summer, Jean phoned to say that she and Marv were going to visit Marv's family in Minnesota for a few weeks. She wondered if Ferne might want to go along with them. Ferne didn't hesitate. Yes, yes, Jean, I want to go.
Divorce, It's Fast and Easy by Arthur Juntunen. If you've been at odds with the little lady, don't frown over your morning coffee, unless you're the type that likes the self-brewed kind. Michigan laws are such that she may not only ask for a divorce, but she may get it under a dozen classifications, which could label you for life as a heel, a wife beater, and a form of monster they'd call a mental cruelist. In fact, says Judge Joseph A. Monahan, the sanctity of the home is practically a myth under the present Michigan divorce statutes. The divorce rate in Wayne County almost doubled since Pearl Harbor, and the number filed in January alone, 2,068, was a new high, yet spouse can shed spouse almost for the sake of a change. In one desertion case recently, no one even bothered to make an appearance, so the decree was granted in less time than it takes to snap your fingers, Judge Monahan said.
For many returning GIs and their wives, the stresses of adjustment were barely manageable. And as the war ended, these strains were reflected in a startling upsurge in the nation's divorce rate. There was no single explanation for this dramatic rise in the number of broken marriages. Contributing factors include the haste with which couples had wed, the strains of wartime separation, and the shock of strangeness and disillusionment on being reunited.
Ferne wanted to believe that love was a force that could heal, but here she was unable to love Abe. She felt deserted, and yet she wondered if perhaps she was deserting him. What she wanted most in life was to have a family, and she wanted to do this with someone who was as steady as her father had been. Abe was definitely too immature. He had always been immature, she thought. Maybe she had too, but now it was different. The war was over and she wanted to get on with her life. When I was 10 years old, my mother told me that she had been married twice before she met my father. She was very young with the first one and it was annulled, she said, although that isn't in the historical record. But the other was a marriage with no children. After she died, that conversation stayed in my mind. I'm sure she never could have imagined that 55 years later, her poet daughter would still be searching for the story of her marriage to George Abriel, sorting through negatives to make photos, developing and replacing prints that her mother had earlier destroyed, trying to discover who he was and what really happened. Martine.
Okay. Novelist Gertrude Stein dies in French hospital, Paris. Gertrude Stein, the novelist, died in American hospital tonight, hospital officials announced. Cause of Miss Stein's death was reported to have been a tumor. Her lifelong friend, Alice Toklas, was at her bedside. The famed expatriate writer set a distinctive style of writing all her own. Miss Stein lived for many years in the Latin Quarter of Paris until the Germans forced her to move south.
I skipped over something, so I'll read it. Ferne probably would have skimmed over the article in the Detroit Times about Gertrude Stein dying, possibly not even knowing who she was, but it called out to me. Gertrude and her circle and my mother and her circle were alive at the same time and lived through the same war. And then before I show you the slides, I'm going to read just a little bit from the coda of the book, which, you know, after this period, Ferne marries and she has 4 children and she dies as a young woman. So just for fun, I start with this poem of the coda. Just for fun, I put mother on my back, yet she weighed so little. I began crying and could not walk 3 steps. That's from Ishikawa Takuboku, 1908. I always like, I'm going to read it one more time. Just for fun, I put mother on my back, yet she weighed so little. I began crying and could not walk 3 steps. Ferne was my first love. For 50 plus years, I've carried her around with me, trying to keep her alive, a bundle of emotions and memories, her love, disappointment, guilt, fear, and her fragility. If she had lived until I was an adult, perhaps I would have come to know her as a particular person in the world, as Ferne Hostetter. Losing her at 11 left me with a child's adoring memory. I've done all that I could with this project to know her better by dwelling on her life and times and recreating her life inside the context in which she lived. Okay, now let me screen share again and show you some of the images from what we've read here. Where it's at? Okay, there it is. Okay. So this is when Martine started out reading from the article, more typists needed for war work. And, you know, we didn't read all of them, but why girls use myths. I had tried to get into this book a lot of the articles that related to women and the times, our times, let off to vote, right? And then the radio announcement, FDR. This here, this was in my grandmother's scrapbook, and it was, people put it on their window after FDR died. These were the headlines of the articles, which this article about the Nazi camp is very moving. I didn't want to have anybody read much more of it for this, but if you have the book, you can read it. Let me make this smaller so you can see it. This is Peace in Europe. This was a headline in the paper. Someone once told me not to go so fast. So this is when Ferne came home. There she is with her husband and her sister's husband, Marv. There they are. I think she has pin curls in her hair with that on. Maybe they surprised them. And there's Marv with little Marvelyn. Across the street is a gas station from my grandmother's house. This is on Alter Road and Mack Avenue. And it used to have a sign when I was growing up, gas, 23.5 cents a gallon. Okay. That's Marv, and there's Ferne's grandfather, my great-grandfather, who lived to 104 years old. He shows up in the book a lot, and that's Jean, but not in this section, not as much, not at all. So these were the headlines that Peter read. You got a little bit of it from you listen to it. And sometimes I had to type up the clippings because they were, the microfilms were so damaged that I had to type them. So, and this is Ferne after she leaves her husband. She's starting to change quite a bit. And there's her sister and his husband, her husband. And there's a Lucky Strikes. Future. Just flipping through so you can see what the pages look like. There she is in Minnesota with little Marvelyn after she leaves. And there we are at the end. Okay, let me take. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Martine and Peter, for doing that.
Excuse me. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you, Martine, and thank you, Peter. And Barbara, I have a lot of questions to ask, and I'm going to start maybe with the plainest one, which is I'm just curious how long you worked on this on the book and all the research that went into it, and how far back did that begin?
I think, well, my dad gave me the photographs, the books, and they gave my dad didn't give it to me. My stepmother and my siblings gave it to me in 1996. And then I think it was a couple years later when I began to take pictures for my siblings, but I don't know what the book came out now, 22. I must have started really working on it in 2015 but at first it was like a collage, you know. A few people have looked at it. I think Kim Lyons saw the original, where I thought it was going to be just sort of a kind of wild collage rather than the story weaving in and out of it. But you know, I just, once I start on something, I don't know what it's going to be. I thought it might be a group of poems. I wasn't sure. It just sort of evolved over time into where I started to think. Somebody told me, Johnny Hardigan told me, he said, why don't you just tell the story? And I thought, okay, I'll just write it like a novel. So, does that answer your question? But
yeah, no, I mean, there, you know, and I imagine there's the writing and the putting it together over those past 6-7 years, and then all of your life and history and thinking that precedes that too. And you know, it's described in your bio on the Rail page as a hybrid biography of Ferne, but then it's also in the title described as a Detroit story. And then, as you just said, it reads like a novel also. And I'm curious about what it was like to do some of the kind of reconstruction of conversations, especially between Ferne and Jean when they were kids, in that sort of context of growing up in the Depression, because you're not just narrating what they were doing, you're actually writing out their conversations. And I was really struck by the way that kind of develops all the way across the book. Then at a certain point, there's a lot more letters, but it seemed like there was must have been some kind of mix of imagination and research and knowing knowing Jean and Ferne to enough of an extent to be able to think about how they would talk to each other. Is that possible?
Yeah, I know that's, um, well, a lot of the stories, the stories, my mother told me some stories when I was young, right? So I always had those in my head, and my cousins had stories and they would tell me these. I interviewed everyone. And when I was in college and I was an undergrad, I took a women's studies class. I always think it must have been the first years they had women's studies classes. And she said we had to write a biography of someone, a woman. And of course, there's this woman that I thought about all the time, my mother, who I loved, who I lost as a young adolescent. And so I went around to my aunts and I interviewed them, and they told me stories. And I wrote a lot of those childhood stories when I was only, a young person in college. And I still have that little collection of, maybe it's 12, 13 pages long or something, single spaced. And so I used those and I just elaborated on them. How do I know how they would talk with each other? Well, I knew my aunt's personality a little bit, and her children who I talked to, or one of her children, Linda, my cousin, who was my age exactly, I would call her up and say, tell me about your mother. What kind of person was she? And then I put that in my mind. And of course, I've raised 2 children and I've been around a lot of children in my life. And so I know how children talk. I know what it's like to be a mother, and that becomes sort of embedded into how I invent these people. I don't know. I just started imagining it, and then I would just get into the scene, become. So.
Just to, I'm going to ask another question, but just to let everybody know, if anybody wants to ask a question or comment on the reading, or ask Barbara about the work, please post something in the chat or just wave your hand and we can unmute you. If for folks who haven't seen the book, it's a big sized book, and the photos and newspaper clippings, as Barbara was showing and talking about, are interwoven with the writing throughout the book. So it's a very straightforward reading experience in one way, but then the way that national history, but specifically what's going on in Detroit from the 20s onward, really comes through next to the writing in an interesting way. Like my eye just kind of moves from the articles and then back over to the narrative, and the articles are always kind of parallel to things that are happening in the narrative in Ferne's life and in the family life. And the picture of Detroit prior to World War II is really fascinating. And I guess I'm just, and that has to do with the automotive industry booming and the Depression coming on, but then a large labor force coming north to work, changing the complexity of the city, changing the demographics of the city, and creating different kinds of dynamics. And Ferne is sort of living throughout all of this. And was it on your mind initially to create that kind of civic and political context around the narrative, or did that develop gradually as you were doing research?
Well, I didn't know I was aiming for this book. That's got the thing is, I didn't know what I was aiming for, but once I started writing around the photographs to begin with, and I was thinking I'm going to write some poems or something like that. But once I started doing that, and then I started getting a bigger idea to get the whole life, even when it was a collage, I know from just my own studies and my own life that context is really important, where you come from. And there was no way I was really going to know her if I didn't really know what the environment she lived in. And of course, I'm curious. I grew up in Detroit and moved to New York City when I was in my late 30s. So, you know, I have a very close feeling with Detroit. And my father worked in the auto industry. And yeah, and so I was just always interested. I had to do something to find out. And I just, in the kind of way that I write poetry, I just sort of follow a lead. Like I found that photograph and I thought, well, that would be cool. You know how you just, you know, I thought I could just go in and get those microfilms and look at that newspaper, because I couldn't get that newspaper online. Some of the, I brought in some things from the free press that you can access online things, which is pretty cool. But that paper you couldn't, but I felt I had to go to that paper. And so I would spend several time, you know, week here and a week there in the Detroit Public Library, because it was only available there and in Lansing. And, you know, and as I started dipping in, it was also interesting. Then I thought, well, I have to narrow this search. I can't read everything. I can't be an expert. I'm not really officially a professional scholar. So I just thought I'll just go in on days of her birthdays and important days to her life and read those and try to find articles that will be of interest to me and to women and families, and to try to blossom out her life. And I did that before I even started writing those stories. I wrote those after I had gathered all this material, you know. And at first I typed up a lot of those articles and had them like a collage, but so yeah, does that
Yeah. Yeah, no, it does. I mean, I'm also just thinking about media in that period and how dominant newspapers were in terms of, I mean, you don't have TV yet, you have radio, but people have the same news sources a lot of the time if they're reading. And it's interesting to kind of get the headlines, but also get the tone and presentation of language inside of those pieces, especially the ones that are focusing on women, and also the ones focusing on smoking, which are also focusing on women. And I should just add that when the Lucky Strike ad was being read, somebody in the audience who you know lit a cigarette and held up a pack of Lucky Strikes to the
oh yeah, I
to
can
the
imagine.
our man Godfrey over there.
That's what I thought it would probably be.
Ron Jansen, did you have your hand up for a sec?
Let's see here.
Oops, he just turned it off.
Oh,
There you go.
open now? Oh, good, thank you. I enjoyed this whole presentation so much. I lived through this period too, but hearing your coherent report about it is so interesting. I just wanted to ask you, it's such a heavy research project. And I'm wondering how all of this affected you personally in terms of understanding or feeling or about the people involved, or, you know, what kind of sense of change in yourself perhaps did you experience in the process of pulling all these things together?
Well, I think one of the really personal things that happened to me is I came to forgive my father a lot for the way he behaved and when I was younger, because he had such a, you know, it just became clearer to me going through the whole life all the way to the end, what he went through, having 4 children, working at a job that was hard to make ends meet, and have his wife die, you know, and he kept us together. But, you know, that was a personal thing. But in terms of, you know, I mean, I kept writing it because I think I always wanted to know her more. You know, a mother dies when you're a young adolescent. And if you're close with your mother, I mean, it can't be all mothers because we're not all that great, but she loved me. And she remained, there's kind of like a time where your mother, I think, is like a goddess to you. And then you start seeing her differently as you become a teenager and you break. Well, I didn't get that. So I kept my goddess and my in there, you know. And so but
Interesting.
yeah, and then it was so interesting to read these things and to see what's happening now compared to then, just politically, to understand better the time that had happened before I was born.
Mm.
You know, like we say now, you know, well, I guess now it's not even that, but we'd say, wow, they don't even know about the Vietnam War. Of course, I didn't know really the things that
Yeah.
happened, you know.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting.
Okay.
My mother's name was Ferne also, by the way.
Great.
Thanks, Ron. I guess I wonder if Peter or Martine, if you want to just talk about what it's like to sort of read in this way. This is, you know, it's a different kind of format, and you're reading these various materials. And how was it? Or how is it?
Well, it was kind of a blast from the past for me because I have a degree in communications, and the school I went to had hangover programs in radio production. So in order to get a degree, we had to do all these radio plays. We had to write radio play scripts and perform them and record them and get graded on it. So it was interesting for me to go back to doing that. And I think when you choreograph multiple voices in a smart way, it really can communicate something special.
I'll add that for me, did you want to say more, Peter?
No.
No. I'll add that when I was reading, I felt as though I was kind of bouncing off of Peter and Barbara, maybe even more Peter, just because of where I felt like we were the context, and that was really interesting. It was a lot of fun, and if I could just make more of an observation, one thing that really struck me about the book is how tracked people are in relationship to this idea of American dream, you know, that we can achieve, and that an American can achieve anything.
Yeah.
And when Ferne was very young, her dream was to be a secretary. And then when she's in high school, she's an honor student, and someone says to her, oh, too bad, maybe you can go to college and you can be a teacher. So it's like the choice was to be a secretary, and this is to be an independent woman, to be a secretary or to be a teacher. Those were the two choices, really. But she was trapped to be the secretary. And so that's what she was trained to do. And then I think about, but obviously education was so important to her. And so then I think that her daughter has a PhD and teaches college and has published many books, and is a poet. And I just find it really moving how what happened between your mom's life and your life, like beyond her wildest dreams.
You know, she said to me closer to the time when she died, to be sure you graduate from high school. Be sure, because she was the only one to graduate from high school out of the 8 children. Of course, they all had to work. You know, that's why they had to work during the Depression. They couldn't afford to go to, because they had to contribute. And that's the reason that she didn't go to college, would be because really her father, she needs to be able to make a living, you know, so yeah.
I was just so impressed by the sheer scope of this book in terms of you gathering the information and putting it together. And I think, well, obviously it was a very passionate project because it's all about reaching back and bringing your parent closer to you, you know, and I just thought that was really beautiful. And I keep telling you how much I love that coda that you partially read. It's just very, very moving. And just the dailiness of it, which communicates the passion as well. I found that interesting too. You know, it's a massive project and it works so well.
I read at the very end of the book, there's this long prose poem that I had written many years before I wrote this. Actually, I read it once at Sidewalk Cafe. I think it was, yeah, when Eleanor and Martha were running that series at the at Sidewalk. I think it was there. And it anyhow, so I end with that, and I love that part of the quote of that ending of that poem. I don't want to say more about it in case people want to read it, but okay.
I have one other question for you, Barbara, and maybe it's more of a personal question on my end, but when my father died, I was 11 also, and I from a father perspective, I understand that sort of relationship as you were describing it before. And I had occasion, I was asked to write something about him recently that required some biography, an introduction for something. And I found it really difficult to get started writing it. And then I found it really, something changed when I kind of got to the point where I was writing about his life while I was alive. Like when I got to the early 70s when I was born, then something shifted in the writing and I could kind of loosen up a little bit. And I'm just sort of curious if when you get to the point where your own consciousness is involved in the story, if the way it felt to write changed at all in any way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I had to do something very different. I couldn't go on writing in the third like that with those narratives of, kind of like a third person narrative. I couldn't do. So that's why, like at the end of the part I read, I come in as the author and read a bit about myself, right? I said, when my mother did this, and that's sort of woven through the book. And I tried to then segue into when I become a conscious being to change the way the writing is. It becomes more memoir interspersed with the story. So I'm still inventing stories that I wouldn't have been able to write about, but it's, I play with the point of view, but I think it happened, somebody would have to tell me if they experience it that way, but I think it happens pretty fluidly. Like I'll have phone conversations with her and letters and then directly memories from come in as I can remember, Yeah, but it is, let's see. Yeah, I think I was thinking as you were talking, Anselm, that your father was a poet and you're a poet. Yeah, and my mother, by the way, was a secretary first, right? And then she becomes a mother. And so when I graduated from high school, I took one class in college and I dropped out and just took a job as a secretary. And I kind of saw myself as a secretary at first because that's what my mother had done. I still have all her shorthand books here. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of, tried to be like her. Maybe that's what you experienced too. I don't know.
It seemed like photography was a really significant activity or outlet for your mother, at least through the volume of materials. I don't know if that's more or less than anybody would take with a camera, but it seemed like the act of taking a picture gets described, very gently here and there at least in the early part of the book once the camera is acquired. And I guess I wonder if Fong has a question, I'm being told. I wonder if photography was something that she talked to you about or that resonates with you differently as an act.
Well, I think they must have anybody who could afford to take the photographs was probably doing it then. It was a big thing. My aunt had say, I looked through all their old photographs, but the thing about my mother, she was so organized with them and he had them all labeled and where my aunts are all in a big box, all mixed up, you know.
Right.
But I think it was, yeah, we liked taking, they bought a camera for me as soon as I was old enough to do it. We had those little box cameras, you know, I can't remember the name of them right now. But yeah, that was very important. And those photographs became very important to me because when she used to let me look at them, as I said in the intro all the time, we'd look back and think about her. And then, but when she died, my dad was very protective of them and he locked them in his room. So I never saw them again. And she died 1960 until 1996 when he died. So they were something I was always longing for.
Yeah. That's a long time. Fong, are you out there? Do you have a question?
Muted, he's muted. Fong, you're muted.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Anselm, for this reading. I was in and out because I was in meeting, but the premise of this gathering, the reading is so beautiful, and it's really needed now because what we are trying to do similarly is to how to reapply the whole idea of what we learned from the past. I think the WPA, when you mention Roosevelt, I can't help to think, but you know, Eleanor was instrumental in getting you know, Franklin to sign up on WPA, the federal project one particularly. So I've been obsessed with her lately, and there's so many profound things. She said things like, one of the best way of enslaving, you know, a person is to keep them from education. That's one thing. She say, never mistake knowledge for wisdom. One can get, one helps you to make a living, while the other help you to make a life, you know? And I just felt like we are going through the similar time right now, where all of that is essential in not only heal what we're going through the crisis recently during the Trump presidency and the pandemic, but it's just something that we shouldn't forgotten at all. And the 30 it's a decade that really make America so resilient. The people, even the portrait of very impoverished people on small town didn't even have a name, but we know that writer was sent there to the program to write about the history of the people. And photographers, Walker Evans and Dorothy Land took their portraits, and they all appear incredibly dignified.
Yeah.
That's something that the humanity of it just make us think differently now at the rail. So thank you so much for this compelling book. I can't wait to read it, Barbara. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Anselm.
So, was somebody out there about to say something? No, it was thank you. It was thank yous. Okay. Barbara, any last word or thought before we open it up and let everybody say hello and goodbye?
No, open it up.
All right, then I just want to add that the book was published by Spuyten Duyvil, and it's a really great job that they did, and it's a beautiful book, and I recommend everybody going and getting a copy if you don't have one. Thank you again, Barbara and Peter. Seen so much.
H.R. Hegnauer designed that book. Yeah,
HR is really, really good.
great poet and a designer. Yeah.
Let's open up and cheers with it. I come over.
All right, then can we open the floodgates?
All right.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Martine. Thank you, Peter.
Everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Barbara.
Beautiful.
Wonderful. And
Thanks,
Thank
Barbara.
you.
Fascinating.
what happened to Maureen? Did she go away?
Hi, Martha. Hi,
Oh, hi.
Greg.
Hi,
Hi,
Bob.
Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
Beautiful, beautiful, Barb. And everyone's reading. Wow. So
Nice
beautifully
job.
orchestrated and written.
Terrific. Hearing the trees.
Hey, Maureen.
Hi, John and
Hi,
Andre.
Maureen.
Lynn, hi, Lynn,
Here's
Hi.
Lynn.
Norman, Lori.
Hi, Patricia.
Enhorabuena, Barbara.
Norma.
Hi, hi, how are you?
Barbara, it was great.
Hi.
Unbelievable
Really was
Fabulous.
fantastic.
project.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, thank you.
Thank
This is
you.
very
John
special group of
Godfrey, I thought I
people.
saw him earlier, but
He
Yeah.
was here.
he
And
probably.
that's
Thank you, Barbara.
great discussion, great questions. Thank you.
We keep up our work,
Yes,
make culture accessible, so it's not kept on in the academy. So that's what we are doing. And
Very good.
for your contribution.
Congratulations.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
wonderful.
good looking, Barbara.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Martine. Thank
Maureen.
you, Barb. Thank you, Anselm.
Where, look at you and all
Bye,
that.
John.
Thank you.
Hey, Norman.
Hi, Norman.
Care, everybody.
Looking forward to seeing you in Detroit.
Yeah.
Puerto Bonito.